When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped, but not from fear of being caught. It was from knowing he would see those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I tried to snatch the phone from his hands, but he smoothly pulled back and kept reading. I watched his face change as he read line by line, feeling my life crumble in mere seconds. Yes, now he would learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew, any moment now he would reach that message that would destroy my life. The one that would explain everything and put a period at the end. Or make things even more confusing. My phone suddenly buzzed in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face go pale as he read the sender's name. My husband froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of realizing what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from the 6 feet separating us. This was exactly what I feared most. Because 3 months ago I made a mistake, the kind that changes everything forever, and now. I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I tried so hard to keep hidden for so long, write in the comments what city you're watching this from, and answer this question: have you ever had a secret you tried desperately to hide but ultimately couldn't? The moving truck across the street caught my attention on a Tuesday morning that felt no different from the 1,000 Tuesdays before it. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching strangers carry boxes and furniture into the house that had been empty for 6 months. 23 years of marriage had taught me to find interest in the smallest disruptions to routine. Someone's finally moving into the Morrison place, I called to David, who sat at our breakfast table absorbed in his tablet, probably checking stock prices or reading news he'd discuss with colleagues but never with me. He responded without looking up. The sound had become his signature response to most things I said. Not dismissive exactly, but not engaged either. Just acknowledgement that I had spoken. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, studying the scene across the street. The movers worked efficiently, their movements practiced and purposeful. But it was the man directing them that held my attention. Even from this distance, I could see he moved differently than David, the fluid, decisive gestures instead of the careful, measured movements my husband had perfected over decades in corporate management. I might bake something, I said, more to myself than to David. Welcome them to the neighborhood. This time David did look up, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose making him look older than his 52 years. That's nice, honey. Very thoughtful. The words were right, but delivered with the same tone he used to approve routine household expenditures. I wondered when everything I said had become background noise to him, when my thoughts and impulses had been relegated to the same category as grocery lists and dental appointments. I watched the new neighbor emerge from the house, gesturing toward a large sofa the movers were struggling with. He was tall, probably mid-40s, with graying hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it. There was something immediately appealing about his apparent stress over the logistics of furniture placement, a humanness that reminded me of emotions I'd forgotten I could feel. David's chair scraped against the hardwood floor as he stood, checking his watch with the precision of a man whose days were measured in 15-minute increments. I'll be late tonight. Client dinner. Another client dinner. Another evening of reheated leftovers eaten alone while background television filled the silence. I nodded, already mentally planning how I'd spend the solitary hours, perhaps that novel I'd been meaning to start, or the garden catalog that had been sitting unopened for weeks. Have a good day, I said, and meant it, though I couldn't remember the last time either of us had described a day as particularly good or bad. Our days simply were, following patterns we'd established without conscious decision. After David left, I found myself gravitating back to the window. The moving truck was nearly empty now, and I could see the new neighbor more clearly. He wore jeans and a navy sweater that had seen better days, clothes that suggested comfort over appearance. When he smiled at something one of the movers said, the expression transformed his entire face. I realized I was staring and stepped back from the window, embarrassed by my own curiosity. When had I become the type of woman who watched neighbors? But even as I moved away, I felt drawn back, finding excuses to pass by the window, checking the weather, adjusting the curtains, watering the plants that lined the sill. By afternoon, the moving truck was gone, leaving only the man and what appeared to be a modest sedan in the driveway. I could see him through his front windows, moving boxes, probably beginning the overwhelming task of transforming a house into a home. I remembered that feeling, though it seemed like a lifetime ago, the possibility contained in empty rooms, the hope that this place might be where happiness finally took root. The impulse to bake wasn't unusual for me. I'd always been the neighbor who brought casseroles during illness, birthday cakes for children, holiday cookies for elderly residents. But as I pulled ingredients from the pantry, flour, sugar, vanilla extract, I acknowledged something different about this motivation. This wasn't community obligation or practiced kindness. This was curiosity about a person who had unknowingly disrupted my carefully maintained equilibrium. As chocolate chip cookies filled the kitchen with warmth and sweetness, I caught my reflection in the chrome surface of the refrigerator. 47 years old, still attractive in the way that suggested good genes and attention to appearance, but somehow faded around the edges. When had my eyes lost their brightness? When had my smile become such a conscious effort? The timer's sharp beep pulled me from self-examination. I arranged the warm cookies on my best plate, the one reserved for company we rarely entertained, and covered them with a tea towel. My hands smoothed my hair, checked my appearance in the hallway mirror, adjusted my sweater, all automatic gestures that felt strangely significant. Standing at my front door with the plate of cookies, I hesitated. This was neighborly kindness, nothing more. Simple courtesy extended to someone beginning a new chapter in an unfamiliar place. But my heartbeat suggested otherwise, drumming with an anticipation I hadn't felt in years. I looked across the street at his house, light glowing warmly in the windows, and realized I was about to step outside my comfortable, predictable world. The evening air was crisp against my skin as I crossed the street, each step carrying me further from the safety of routine and closer to something I couldn't yet name. His front door was solid oak with a brass knocker that looked recently polished. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated, suddenly aware of how presumptuous this might seem. But before I could retreat, the door opened, and I found myself face to face with the man I'd been watching from across the street. Up close, he was more striking than I'd realized. His eyes were dark brown with flecks of gold, and lines around them suggested someone who smiled often. He wore the same navy sweater, now slightly rumpled, and there was a small streak of dust across his left temple. "Oh," he said, clearly surprised. "Hello. I'm sorry to bother you," I began, suddenly feeling foolish. "I live across the street, and I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." I held up the plate of cookies, the tea towel fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. His face broke into that transformative smile I'd glimpsed from my window. "That's incredibly kind of you. Please, come in." He stepped aside, gesturing me into his home. "I'm afraid it's complete chaos in here." The living room was indeed a maze of boxes and misplaced furniture, but somehow it felt more alive than my own perfectly arranged house. The air smelled of cardboard and possibility, of fresh starts and unwritten stories. "I'm sorry about the mess," he said, clearing newspapers from a chair. "I'm still trying to figure out where everything goes. Or if I even need half of what I brought." "Moving is overwhelming," I agreed, settling into the chair he'd cleared. "It takes time to make a place feel like home." He disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen and returned with 2 glasses of water. I should probably offer you wine, but I'm not even sure which box it's in. He handed me a glass, his fingers briefly touching mine. The contact was brief, innocent, but it sent an unexpected warmth up my arm. Water is perfect, I said, though my voice sounded slightly breathless even to my own ears. We talked easily, about the neighborhood, local services, the best grocery stores and restaurants. He had an attentive way of listening that made me feel heard in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. When I mentioned the farmers' market on Saturday mornings, his eyes lit up. I love farmers' markets, he said. There's something honest about buying food from the people who grow it. I found myself nodding enthusiastically, though I couldn't remember the last time David had accompanied me to the market. He preferred the efficiency of chain supermarkets, the predictability of identical products in identical packaging. What brought you to our quiet little street? I asked, then immediately worried the question was too personal for a first meeting. Fresh start, he said simply, but something in his expression suggested layers beneath those two words. Sometimes you reach a point where staying feels more difficult than leaving. I understood that feeling more than I cared to admit. How many times had I stood in my own kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived according to external measures, and felt like I was slowly disappearing? The conversation continued as daylight faded outside his windows. He told me about his work as a freelance graphic designer, the freedom of creating his own schedule, the challenge of building a business in a new city. I found myself sharing things I rarely discussed, my abandoned plans to return to teaching, the ceramic classes I'd been considering, small dreams that seemed too insignificant to mention in my real life. Why did you stop teaching? He asked, leaning forward slightly in his chair. Life, I said, then realized how insufficient that answer was. Marriage, I suppose. David's career required flexibility from me, and teaching didn't offer that. At least, that's what we decided at the time. And now? The question hung in the air between us. Now. What did I want now? I'd stopped asking myself that question years ago, accepting that wanting things was a luxury for younger women, women who hadn't already made their choices and built their lives around them. I don't know, I admitted, and the honesty of it surprised me. He nodded as if my uncertainty made perfect sense. Not knowing is the beginning of knowing, I think. When I finally stood to leave, the evening had grown dark. He walked me to the door, thanking me again for the cookies, for the company, for the welcome to the neighborhood. On his front porch, I turned to say goodbye, and found him closer than I'd expected. Thank you, he said softly. This has been the best part of an overwhelming day. The space between us seemed charged with possibility. I could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the dust of moving day. Something passed between us in that moment, recognition, perhaps, or acknowledgement of an attraction that felt both sudden and inevitable. Before I could think, before I could analyze or rationalize, he leaned down and I lifted my face toward his. We kissed. It was gentle, questioning, like a conversation in a language I'd forgotten I knew. My heart hammered against my ribs as I felt his lips on mine, warm and soft and completely different from the perfunctory kisses that marked the beginning and end of David's days. When we broke apart, I felt dizzy, as if I'd been holding my breath underwater and had finally surfaced. The rational part of my mind was already cataloging the implications of what had just happened, but another part, a part I'd thought permanently dormant, was singing with life. I should go, I whispered, though every instinct urged me to stay. He nodded, understanding flooding his features. Of course. I walked back across the street on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of his presence behind me, of his eyes following my progress. Inside my own house, I leaned against the closed door, touching my lips with trembling fingers. The taste of him lingered, foreign and thrilling. In the space of one evening, my carefully ordered world had shifted on its axis, and I wasn't sure I could ever set it right again. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay next to David's sleeping form, listening to his steady breathing while my mind replayed every moment of the evening across the street. The kiss played on loop, the warmth of it, the rightness of it, the way it had awakened parts of me I'd forgotten existed. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his lips on mine again, and guilt would flood through me like ice water. What kind of woman was I? 23 years of marriage, a respected member of the community, a person others looked to for stability and propriety. And yet, one conversation with a stranger had unraveled something fundamental in me. I told myself it was loneliness, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by years of emotional neglect. But even as I constructed these rational explanations, I knew they were insufficient. David stirred beside me, and I held my breath, afraid that somehow my infidelity was visible, radiating from my skin like heat. But he simply adjusted his pillow and settled back into sleep, oblivious to the revolution occurring inches away from him. Morning brought no clarity, only the harsh reality of routine. David emerged from the shower at precisely 7:15, dressed in one of his identical gray suits, and kissed my cheek with the same distracted affection he'd shown for years. The kiss felt like a betrayal, not his betrayal, but mine. How could I accept his casual intimacy when my lips still remembered another man's touch? "Coffee's ready," I said, my voice sounding normal despite the chaos in my chest. "Thanks, honey." He poured his coffee into the travel mug I'd given him for his last birthday, added exactly 1 spoonful of sugar, and checked his watch. "I'll probably be late again tonight. Jenkins wants to review the Morrison account." I nodded, wondering if he noticed that I no longer asked about his work, no longer showed interest in the details of his professional life. When had we stopped sharing the minutiae of our days? When had "probably be late" become his default evening plan? After David left, I found myself at the kitchen window again, ostensibly watering the plants but actually scanning his house for signs of life. His car was gone, he was probably exploring the city, finding new coffee shops and grocery stores, building a life in his new space. I envied him that freedom to discover, to choose, to start fresh without the weight of decades of accumulated habit. The rational voice in my head insisted I should avoid him. Last night had been an aberration, a moment of weakness that could be contained if I simply refused to repeat it. I had a good life, comfortable, predictable, secure. David was a good man, faithful and responsible. What more could I reasonably expect at 47? But as I moved through my daily routine, grocery shopping, laundry, the mundane maintenance of household life, I felt like I was sleepwalking through someone else's existence. Every task felt mechanical, performed by muscle memory while my real self remained suspended in the memory of that kiss. At the supermarket, I found myself in the wine aisle, remembering his comment about not knowing which box contained his wine. Without conscious decision, I selected a bottle of Pinot Noir, telling myself it was just neighborly politeness. A proper welcome gift to replace the hastily baked cookies. The afternoon stretched endlessly. I tried to read, but the words blurred together meaninglessly. I attempted to organize closets, but found myself staring into space, remembering the warmth in his eyes when he looked at me. Everything felt colored by his presence in my life, as if the world had been black and white and he had introduced color. When his car pulled into the driveway at 4:30, my heart leaped involuntarily. I watched from my window as he unloaded grocery bags, noting the ease of his movements, the way he paused to greet an elderly neighbor walking her dog. There was something magnetic about his unself-conscious kindness, the way he seemed genuinely pleased by small human interactions. The bottle of wine sat on my kitchen counter, accusatory in its implications. Taking it to him would be crossing a line, acknowledging that last night meant something beyond momentary impulse. But not taking it felt like cowardice, like denying something beautiful because it was inconvenient. I picked up the bottle, then set it down. Picked it up again. The internal debate raged for 20 minutes before I finally grabbed my keys and crossed the street before I could change my mind. He answered the door in jeans and a white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that suggested physical work at some point in his past. His face lit up when he saw me, and something loosened in my chest. "I thought you might need this," I said, holding up the wine. "Since you mentioned not knowing which box it was in." "You didn't have to do that," he said, but his smile suggested he was pleased. Though I have to admit, I was just thinking how nice a glass of wine would be after a day of unpacking. He invited me in again, and this time the house looked more settled. Pictures leaned against walls waiting to be hung, books were stacked on makeshift shelves, and the kitchen showed signs of actual use. "It's looking more like home," I observed. "Getting there," he agreed, opening the wine with practiced efficiency. "Though I'm discovering I own far more things than any one person needs." He poured 2 glasses and handed me one. The wine was excellent, smooth and warming, but I barely tasted it. I was too aware of him, the way he moved around the space, the sound of his voice, the fact that we were alone together again despite every rational argument for staying away. "I should probably apologize for last night," he said suddenly, his directness catching me off guard. "For what?" I asked, though my pulse quickened. "For overstepping. You're married, you're my neighbor, and I." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I don't usually act so impulsively." The wine loosened something in me, or perhaps it was the relief of having the elephant in the room acknowledged. "I don't usually either," I admitted. "Act impulsively, I mean." We stood looking at each other across his kitchen island, the weight of unspoken things filling the space between us. I knew I should agree with his apology, should establish boundaries, should protect the life I'd built across the street. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I'm not sorry it happened." The words hung between us like a bridge I'd just decided to cross. His eyes searched my face, looking for certainty I wasn't sure I possessed. But the wine had stripped away my usual caution, and for once I wanted to be honest about what I felt instead of what I should feel. "I'm not sorry either," he said quietly, setting down his wine glass. "But I don't want to complicate your life." "My life is already complicated," I said, surprised by my own candor. "It's just been complicated in ways that feel empty." He moved around the kitchen island slowly, giving me time to retreat if I wanted to. I didn't retreat. When he reached me, he raised his hand to my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. The touch was gentle, reverent, like I was something precious he was afraid to break. "I've been thinking about you all day," he admitted. "About last night. About how long it's been since I've felt this immediate connection with someone." I should have asked about his past, about what had brought him here seeking a fresh start. But all my usual social conventions felt irrelevant in the face of this raw honesty. Instead, I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "I keep telling myself this is crazy," I whispered. "That I'm a rational woman who doesn't do things like this." "Maybe being rational is overrated," he said, his voice low and warm. "Maybe sometimes the heart knows things the mind hasn't figured out yet." His hands found my waist, and I felt the heat of his touch through my sweater. Everything about this moment felt both foreign and familiar, like remembering a language I'd once spoken fluently. With David, intimacy had become routine, predictable, a maintenance function of marriage. This felt like discovery. "I don't even know your name," I realized suddenly, the absurdity of it making me laugh despite the tension. "Michael," he said, smiling at my laughter. "And you're the mysterious neighbor who bakes perfect cookies and asks thoughtful questions." "Sarah," I said, though hearing my name in his voice felt like christening a new version of myself. "Sarah," he repeated, like he was testing how it felt on his tongue. Then he kissed me again. This kiss was different from the gentle question of the night before. This was an answer, a decision, a step forward into unknown territory. His lips were warm and certain, and I felt something inside me uncurl and stretch toward the light like a plant that had been kept in darkness too long. We kissed for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, learning each other's rhythms, discovering this new language we were creating together. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless and dizzy with want. "I should go," I said, though the words felt like lies. "Should you?" he asked, not pressing but offering me the choice. I looked around his kitchen, at the evidence of a life being rebuilt, at the possibility contained in unopened boxes and unhung pictures. Then I looked at him, this man who had appeared in my carefully ordered world like a question I hadn't known I needed to ask. "David won't be home until late," I heard myself say, the words emerging from some brave part of me I'd forgotten existed. "Are you sure?" Michael asked, his hands still resting lightly on my waist. Was I sure? I was sure that 24 hours ago I couldn't have imagined standing in a stranger's kitchen contemplating infidelity. I was sure that everything about this situation contradicted every principle I'd thought I lived by. I was sure that crossing this line would change everything, irrevocably and completely. "No," I said honestly. "I'm not sure about anything. But I'm tired of being sure. I'm tired of having all the answers when I don't even remember what the questions were." He studied my face in the golden late afternoon light filtering through his kitchen windows. "We don't have to decide everything right now," he said gently. "We can just see what happens." The permission implicit in his words unlocked something in me. For the first time in decades, I could simply be present in a moment without calculating its implications or managing its outcomes. I could be Sarah, not David's wife, not the perfect neighbor, not the woman who always had dinner ready and thank you notes written, just Sarah, responding to connection and desire and the simple human need to be seen and wanted. I stepped closer to him, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "What if we stop thinking for a while?" I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. His answer was to kiss me again, deeper this time, with a certainty that matched the decision crystallizing in my chest. We kissed, and the careful boundaries of my life dissolved like sugar in water. We kissed, and I felt myself becoming someone I'd forgotten I could be, alive, passionate, present in my own body in a way that felt both completely new and like coming home. As evening fell outside his windows, painting the kitchen in shadows and golden light, I realized I had arrived at a crossroads I hadn't seen coming. The path back to my old life stretched behind me, familiar and safe and increasingly impossible to imagine walking again. Ahead lay uncertainty, complication, the potential for both transcendent joy and devastating loss. Standing in Michael's arms, tasting wine and possibility on his lips, I chose the uncertain path. For the first time in years, I chose the thing I wanted rather than the thing I should want. The decision felt both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff and discovering I had wings. The hours that followed passed like a dream I was afraid to wake from. Michael's living room became our sanctuary, boxes pushed aside to make space for us on his couch. We talked in whispers even though no one could hear us, sharing stories about our lives with the urgency of people who knew time was borrowed. He told me about his divorce 2 years ago, about leaving a corporate job that had consumed his soul, about choosing uncertainty over security. I found myself revealing things I'd never spoken aloud, my abandoned dreams, the gradual erosion of intimacy in my marriage, the way I'd become invisible to myself somewhere along the way. When darkness finally settled completely outside his windows, neither of us mentioned that I should leave. The rational voice in my head had grown quieter with each passing hour, overwhelmed by the intoxicating experience of being truly seen by another person. Michael looked at me like I was fascinating, like my thoughts and opinions mattered, like I was someone worth listening to rather than someone whose presence was simply expected. I should call David, I said eventually, though my phone remained untouched in my purse. Let him know I won't wait up. Will he think that's strange? Michael asked, his fingers tracing absent patterns on my arm. No, I realized with a mixture of sadness and relief. He'll probably be grateful. He usually falls asleep watching television in his study anyway. The truth of that statement settled between us. How had I accepted such emotional distance for so long? When had I stopped expecting more from the person who was supposed to be my closest companion? David and I existed in parallel lines now, sharing space and resources and history but rarely touching at any meaningful point. Michael's hand found mine, warm and solid and present. I don't want you to do anything you'll regret, he said softly. I mean that. I looked into his eyes, those brown eyes flecked with gold that seemed to hold genuine care for my well-being. When was the last time someone had worried about my regrets? When had someone last considered what I might want rather than what I should provide? I think I'll regret not staying more than I'll regret staying, I whispered. The decision made itself somewhere deep in my chest, bypassing my analytical mind entirely. I called David from Michael's kitchen, my voice steady as I told him I was having wine with our new neighbor, that I'd probably stay late helping him get settled. David's response was distracted, pleased, even anything that kept me occupied so he could work late without guilt. Don't wait up, I said, the words carrying more weight than David could possibly understand. Have fun, honey, he replied, already mentally back to whatever case file commanded his attention. When I hung up, Michael was watching me carefully. Are you sure? He asked for the third time that evening. No, I said honestly. But I'm sure I want to find out. We spent the night together. The phrase seems inadequate for what actually happened, the slow discovery of who we were when stripped of our public selves, the revelation that my body could still respond with startling intensity, the way conversation wove seamlessly with touch and silence. I had forgotten what it felt like to be desired, to be explored rather than simply accommodated. In Michael's arms, I remembered that I was more than a collection of roles and responsibilities. I was Sarah, complex and alive and worthy of passion. Morning arrived too quickly, gray dawn light filtering through unfamiliar windows. I woke gradually, disoriented by the foreign ceiling before memory flooded back. Michael's breathing was even beside me, his face peaceful in sleep. For a moment, I allowed myself to simply observe him, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the line of his jaw, the vulnerability that sleep brought to his features. Reality crept in slowly, then all at once. I was a married woman in another man's bed. I had crossed every line I'd drawn for myself, violated every principle I thought I held sacred. The magnitude of what I'd done should have crushed me with guilt, but instead I felt alive. More alive than I had in years. I slipped from the bed carefully, gathering my clothes from where they'd been discarded in last night's careful urgency. Michael stirred as I dressed, his eyes opening to focus on me with immediate awareness. Morning, he said softly, his voice rough with sleep. Morning, I replied, suddenly shy in the harsh light of day. Regrets, he asked, the question gentle but important. I considered the question seriously, taking inventory of my emotional state. Guilt was there, certainly, but it was overshadowed by something else, a sense of recognition, of coming home to myself after a long absence. No, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. No regrets. He smiled then, that transformative smile that had first caught my attention, and reached for my hand. Good, he said simply. I knew I needed to leave before the neighborhood woke completely, before Mrs. Patterson next door began her morning dog walk, before the mail carrier made his rounds. But standing in Michael's bedroom, looking down at this man who had reminded me I was capable of feeling deeply, I struggled to make my feet move toward the door. This is complicated, I said unnecessarily. Yes, he agreed. It is. I don't know what happens next. Neither do I. He sat up in bed, sheet pooling around his waist, completely unself-conscious in his nakedness. But I'd like to find out, if you're willing. The implications of that statement hung between us. This wasn't a one-night aberration, a momentary lapse in judgment that could be contained and forgotten. This was the beginning of something, though neither of us could say what. I leaned down and kissed him, tasting possibility and complication in equal measure. I should go, I whispered against his lips. I know, he said, but his hand found the back of my neck, holding me close for another moment. When I finally pulled away and walked toward his front door, I felt his eyes following me. At the threshold, I turned back one more time, memorizing his face in the morning light, storing this moment against whatever was to come. The walk across the street felt like traveling between two worlds, from one where I was Sarah, passionate and alive and desired, to another where I was simply David's wife, keeper of routines and maintainer of appearances. But as I slipped into my own house, I carried the first world with me like a secret flame, warming me from within. The transformation had begun, and there was no going back. David was already gone when I entered our house, his coffee cup rinsed and placed in the dishwasher with his characteristic precision. I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by the familiar evidence of our shared life, wedding photos on the refrigerator, his prescription bottles lined up by the coffee maker, the grocery list we maintained in both our handwriting, and felt like an imposter in my own existence. The shower water ran hot against my skin, washing away the physical evidence of the night while doing nothing to diminish the memory of it. I scrubbed my body with unusual attention, hyper-aware of every place Michael had touched me, every nerve ending that still hummed with remembrance. The guilt I'd expected to overwhelm me remained strangely absent, replaced instead by a bone-deep satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. But as I dried my hair and applied the makeup that would present me as the same woman who had left this house yesterday, reality began to reassert itself. I was 47 years old, married for 23 years, a respected member of our community. I served on the library board, organized the annual charity auction, hosted book club meetings in my living room. Last night, I had become an adulteress. The word sat heavy in my mind as I dressed for the day, crisp white blouse, navy cardigan, the uniform of respectability I'd perfected over decades. Adulteress. It sounded biblical, laden with judgment and consequence. But looking at myself in the bedroom mirror, I couldn't reconcile the gravity of that label with the woman staring back at me. She looked the same as always, perhaps a bit brighter around the eyes, certainly more relaxed than usual. She didn't look like someone who had committed a grave moral transgression. The phone rang as I was making coffee, David calling between meetings to check in, a habit he'd maintained throughout our marriage. "How was your evening?" he asked, the question automatic rather than curious. "Nice," I said, testing how much truth I could embed in the simple word. "He seems like a good addition to the neighborhood." Good. "I'll probably be late again tonight, the Mitchell case is heating up." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by self-recrimination. When had I begun to prefer my husband's absence? When had his presence become something to navigate rather than enjoy? "That's fine," I said. "I have book club tonight anyway." But even as we spoke, my eyes were drawn to Michael's house across the street. His car was in the driveway, he was home, probably drinking his morning coffee, probably thinking about last night just as I was. The knowledge that he was so close, that I could walk across the street and knock on his door, filled me with a restless energy I didn't know how to contain. Book club that evening was a special kind of torture. 8 women gathered in my living room, discussing the month's selection with varying degrees of insight and attention. I served wine and cheese, nodded at appropriate intervals, and contributed observations about character development and thematic elements while my mind remained firmly focused on the man across the street. "Sarah seems distracted tonight," commented Margaret, our self-appointed group leader, with the sharp observation skills that made her simultaneously valuable and insufferable. Just tired, I deflected, refilling wine glasses to avoid her penetrating gaze. David's been working late a lot lately. The sympathetic murmurs that followed this explanation were familiar. Most of us had husbands whose careers demanded sacrifice from their wives, whose important work justified our relegated status as support systems. We'd all made our peace with this arrangement years ago, or so I'd thought. But tonight, listening to the usual complaints about inattentive spouses and forgotten anniversaries, I felt disconnected from the shared martyrdom that usually bonded us. These women saw their romantic disappointments as inevitable, the natural result of long marriages and aging. I'd accepted that narrative for years, but last night had shattered it completely. Passion wasn't reserved for the young. Connection wasn't doomed to fade. I wasn't condemned to emotional starvation simply because I'd passed 40. Marriage requires constant work, Margaret was saying, holding court with her usual authority. The excitement of the early years gives way to deeper, more meaningful connection. I nodded automatically while privately rejecting every word. What if excitement didn't have to fade? What if the deeper connection we praised was just elaborate rationalization for settling? What if we'd all convinced ourselves that emotional numbness was wisdom when it was really just resignation? Through my living room window, I could see lights glowing warmly in Michael's house. Was he thinking about me? Was he questioning his decision to get involved with a married woman, or was he as certain as I'd been this morning that we'd chosen correctly? The book club discussion continued around me, but I felt removed from it, watching from outside a life that no longer quite fit. These women were my friends, the social framework I'd built my identity around for decades. But sitting among them now, I felt like I was wearing a costume that had grown uncomfortable, playing a role I'd outgrown without realizing it. When the evening finally ended and I'd cleaned up the wine glasses and straightened the throw pillows, I found myself at the kitchen window again. Michael's house was dark now except for one upstairs window, his bedroom, where we'd shared something I'd thought was lost to me forever. David arrived home as I was loading the dishwasher, his usual post-work routine beginning with a kiss on my cheek and a summary of his day. I listened to his account of legal strategies and client demands while studying his face in the kitchen light. He was still handsome at 52, distinguished in the way that served men well in professional settings. But looking at him now, I realized I felt nothing beyond mild affection, the kind reserved for longtime friends or distant relatives. "How was book club?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Fine," I said. We discussed the usual themes of love and loss. "Sounds profound," he said with gentle teasing, the kind of dismissal I'd accepted for years. But tonight, his casual diminishment of something I cared about felt different. Not hurtful exactly, but illuminating. David had never taken my interests seriously, had never engaged with the things that mattered to me beyond polite inquiry. I'd interpreted this as masculine practicality, but perhaps it was simply indifference. As we went through our bedtime routine in parallel, him reviewing files in his study, me reading in bed, I marveled at how completely separate our lives had become. We shared space and finances and history, but we no longer shared curiosity about each other's inner lives. We were business partners in the enterprise of marriage, efficient and cordial but no longer truly intimate. Lying in bed beside David's sleeping form, I felt the full weight of my situation settling over me. I had tasted something extraordinary with Michael, something I'd forgotten was possible. But I was trapped in a life built on different assumptions, surrounded by expectations and obligations that suddenly felt suffocating. The woman who had walked into Michael's house yesterday evening would have been horrified by my thoughts tonight. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that safety wasn't worth the price if it cost you your soul. The next few days passed in a haze of hyper-awareness. Every mundane task, grocery shopping, dry cleaning pickup, lunch with my sister, felt surreal, like I was moving through my regular life while inhabiting a completely different emotional landscape. I found myself analyzing conversations and interactions with new eyes, questioning assumptions I'd held for decades about marriage, commitment, and what constituted a well-lived life. Michael and I hadn't spoken since that morning, though I'd caught glimpses of him coming and going from his house. The restraint felt necessary but torturous. I needed time to process what had happened between us, but I also craved his presence with an intensity that surprised me. He represented more than physical attraction. He was proof that I could still feel deeply, that passion wasn't extinct in my life but merely dormant. David, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of any change in our domestic ecosystem. He followed his usual patterns with clockwork precision, and I realized with startling clarity how little attention he paid to my emotional state. I could have been replaced by a well-programmed automaton and he might not have noticed for weeks. The revelation should have been devastating, but instead it felt liberating. If David was content with surface-level interaction, if he genuinely didn't require emotional intimacy from our marriage, then perhaps my newfound awakening didn't have to destroy what we'd built together. Perhaps we could coexist in our respective realities without collision. But Thursday afternoon, that fragile equilibrium shattered. I was arranging flowers in the front hall when the doorbell rang. Through the glass panels, I could see Michael's silhouette, and my heart began racing before I'd even processed the implications of his presence at my front door. I opened it with hands that trembled slightly, hyper-aware that we were exposed to the scrutiny of the entire neighborhood. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said formally, his voice carrying none of the warmth I'd grown accustomed to. "But I'm having trouble with my kitchen sink and wondered if you might know a reliable plumber." The mundane nature of his request was clearly performance, but his eyes held something more urgent. Behind the polite neighborly inquiry was a message I couldn't quite decipher. "Of course," I said, my own voice carefully neutral. "Let me get you the number we use." I invited him into the front hall while I searched for the plumber's business card, acutely aware of his presence in my home for the first time. He looked around with careful interest, taking in the family photos lining the entryway, the evidence of a life shared with another man. I wondered what he was thinking, whether he was imagining me in these spaces, whether the reality of my domestic situation was hitting him with new force. "Nice house," he said when I returned with the card. "Thank you." I handed him the number, our fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Even that minimal contact sent electricity up my arm. "Tom's very reliable. He's done work for us several times." "I appreciate it." He pocketed the card without looking at it. "Actually, there's something else. I wanted to let you know I'll be traveling for work next week. A potential client in Chicago wants to meet in person." The casual statement hit me like a physical blow. He was leaving, even if temporarily, and I realized how much I'd been depending on simply knowing he was across the street. The possibility of his absence opened up a hollow space in my chest I hadn't known existed. "That sounds like a good opportunity," I managed to say. "I hope so." His eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary. "I'm not sure how long I'll be gone. Could be a few days, could be longer if things go well." The subtext was clear. He was giving me time and space to decide what I wanted, creating distance that would allow me to return to my regular life if that's what I chose. The thoughtfulness of it made me want to reach for him, but we were standing in my front hall surrounded by wedding photos and evidence of my marriage. "Travel safely," I said instead. After he left, I remained in the front hall for several minutes, staring at the closed door. The house felt different with the knowledge that he'd been inside it, like he'd left some invisible mark of his presence. When David came home that evening, I felt exposed, certain he would sense the intrusion of another man's energy into our space. But David noticed nothing. He kissed my cheek with his usual distraction, mentioned that he'd be working late again, and settled into his evening routine without comment. I watched him flip through mail and check his phone with the same attention he'd give to any minor household detail, and felt a profound loneliness settle over me. The weekend stretched ahead with ominous emptiness. David had golf Saturday morning, then client work that would keep him occupied through Sunday evening. Normally, I would fill the solitary hours with reading, gardening, or catching up on correspondence. But the prospect of 48 hours alone with my thoughts felt overwhelming. Saturday morning, I watched David load his golf clubs with the efficiency of long practice. He looked handsome in his weekend uniform of khakis and polo shirt, every inch the successful professional relaxing between important endeavors. "Enjoy your golf," I said, kissing him goodbye with the automatic affection of decades. "I'll try not to embarrass myself," he replied with his standard pre-golf joke. After he left, I found myself at the kitchen window again, looking across at Michael's house. His car was gone. He'd left for Chicago that morning as planned. The knowledge that he was hundreds of miles away should have provided relief, space to think clearly about my situation. Instead, it intensified the restless energy that had been building all week. I tried to distract myself with household tasks, but everything felt pointless. Dusting furniture that wasn't dirty, organizing closets that were already orderly, preparing meals for one person who barely noticed what he ate. The routine that had once provided comfort now felt like elaborate procrastination, like I was killing time until my real life could begin. By Sunday evening, I'd reached a conclusion that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. My marriage to David wasn't broken, it was simply insufficient. We'd built something functional and respectable, but we'd lost the essential spark that made partnership meaningful. David seemed content with our arrangement, satisfied with companionship that demanded little emotional investment. But I wasn't content anymore, and I couldn't pretend to be. When Michael returned from Chicago, I would have to decide what kind of life I wanted to live. The safe choice was obvious: maintain the status quo, appreciate what I had, accept that passion was a luxury for younger women. But the alternative, risky as it was, promised something I'd thought was lost forever: the possibility of being truly known and desired by another person. As David settled into his study for another evening of work, barely acknowledging my presence, I understood that my period of indecision was ending. Whatever happened next would require courage I wasn't sure I possessed, but the alternative, returning to emotional hibernation, had become impossible. Michael's house stood dark across the street, but Monday he would return, and with him would come the moment of choice I could no longer postpone. Michael returned on a Wednesday that felt heavy with anticipated storm clouds. I watched his car pull into the driveway from my usual position at the kitchen window, my heart hammering with a combination of relief and terror. 3 days had given me clarity about what I wanted, but clarity and courage were different things entirely. David was in depositions all week, leaving early and returning late, which should have provided perfect cover for any conversation I might need to have with Michael. But Wednesday evening came and went without contact between us. Thursday passed the same way. By Friday, I was convinced he'd decided our situation was too complicated, that the Chicago trip had given him perspective on the wisdom of avoiding married women. The possibility that he might withdraw from whatever was developing between us created a panic I hadn't anticipated. I'd spent days agonizing over my choices, but I hadn't seriously considered that the choice might not be mine to make. The idea that Michael might simply disappear from my life felt devastating in a way that revealed how deeply he'd already become embedded in my emotional landscape. Friday evening, David announced he was playing poker with colleagues, a monthly tradition I'd forgotten about in my preoccupation with Michael's return. The game would keep him out until after midnight, providing the perfect opportunity for a conversation I'd been both craving and dreading. I waited until David left before crossing the street, my hands shaking slightly as I knocked on Michael's door. When he answered, the sight of his face is familiar now in a way that felt both intimate and surreal, nearly undid my carefully planned composure. "Sarah," he said, his voice careful and neutral. "How are you?" "Confused," I admitted. "May I come in?" He stepped aside, gesturing me into the house that looked more settled than it had the week before. Pictures hung on walls now, books filled the shelves, and the space had taken on the lived-in quality that transforms a house into a home. "How was Chicago?" I asked, though the question felt insufficient for everything I wanted to know. "Productive," he said. "I got the contract. They want me to relocate permanently." The words hit me like cold water. Relocate. Permanently. He was leaving, not just for business trips but forever, and I would return to my carefully ordered life as if these past weeks had been a dream. "Congratulations," I managed to say, though the word tasted like ash. "Thank you." He studied my face carefully. "It's a good opportunity. A chance to start completely fresh somewhere new." We stood in his living room, the weight of unspoken things filling the space between us. He was giving me an out, I realized. A clean ending to something that had barely begun, a way to return to my marriage without the complications of an ongoing affair. It was generous and practical and exactly what a rational woman in my situation should want. "When would you leave?" I asked. "They're flexible. A month, maybe 6 weeks to wrap things up here." "A month. 6 weeks at most." The timeline created urgency that made my chest tight with something between panic and determination. "I need to tell you something," I said, the words emerging before I'd fully formed the thought. "These past weeks, since that first night, I've been trying to convince myself it was a mistake, that I should go back to the way things were." He nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "That would probably be the smart thing to do. But I can't." The admission hung between us, raw and honest. "I can't pretend I don't feel this. I can't go back to sleepwalking through my life just because it's safer." Something shifted in his expression, wariness giving way to hope. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want you to go to Chicago. I'm saying I want to see where this leads, even though it's complicated and messy and probably impossible." He moved closer, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne. "Sarah, I need you to be sure. If we continue this, if I turn down Chicago, there's no going back. It changes everything." "I know." The certainty in my voice surprised me. "I know it changes everything. But staying the same is killing me slowly. I'd rather take the risk." He reached for my hands, his touch warm and steady. "And David?" The question I'd been avoiding for weeks hung between us. What about David? What about 23 years of marriage, shared history, mutual friends, financial entanglement, the life we'd built together? "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know how to handle David, or what this means for my marriage. I just know I can't give this up before I understand what it is." Michael's thumbs traced circles on the backs of my hands, the simple touch sending warmth up my arms. "I turned down Chicago," he said quietly. "What?" My heart jumped. "When?" "This morning. Before I knew you'd come over, before this conversation. I turned it down because I couldn't stand the thought of leaving you." The relief that flooded through me was so intense it left me dizzy. He wasn't leaving. He'd chosen to stay, chosen to explore this connection despite its complications. The knowledge that I wasn't alone in this wanting, this willingness to risk everything for something real, felt like stepping into sunlight after months of gray weather. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now we figure it out together," he said, and kissed me. This kiss felt different from the others, not desperate or questioning, but solid with decision. We were choosing each other, choosing this path despite its uncertainty. As his arms wrapped around me, I felt the last of my resistance dissolve. Whatever consequences this choice brought, whatever pain or joy or chaos lay ahead, I was committed now. The sound of a car door slamming outside made us break apart, hearts racing with shared panic. Through the window, I could see David's sedan in our driveway, hours earlier than expected. He stood beside the car, looking directly at Michael's house, and even from this distance I could see the tension in his posture. "He's home early," I whispered, my mouth going dry with fear. Michael moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. "He's not moving. Just standing there, looking at the house." I joined him at the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. David remained motionless beside his car, staring at Michael's house with an intensity that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking for. How long had he been suspicious? What had given us away? "I have to go," I said, panic making my voice tight. "If he comes to the door." "The back door," Michael said quickly. "Through the garden. You can cut between the houses." But even as he spoke, we both knew it was too late. David had started walking toward Michael's front door, his movement deliberate and determined. In 30 seconds, he would be knocking, demanding answers to questions I wasn't prepared to handle. Everything I'd built, everything I'd risked, was about to come crashing down around me. Point 4S. I need to write Chapter 9 as the final chapter, and it needs to have a sharp, cliffhanger ending that leaves readers wanting more and rushing to the comments. The setup is perfect. David is walking toward Michael's house, Sarah is trapped inside, and everything is about to be exposed. This is the critical moment. For Chapter 9, I need to show the immediate crisis and tension. Have Sarah make some kind of decision or take action. Create a resolution that's actually more of a cliffhanger. End very abruptly to leave maximum impact. Keep it to exactly 1,000 words. This should be the most intense chapter yet, with maximum emotional payoff but leaving key questions unanswered. David's footsteps on the front walkway sounded like countdown to destruction. My mind raced through impossible scenarios, hiding upstairs, pretending Michael wasn't home, somehow explaining my presence in ways that wouldn't shatter everything I'd built with my husband. But each option felt flimsy, desperate, doomed to fail under David's methodical examination. "Sarah." Michael's voice was steady despite the crisis bearing down on us. "Look at me." I turned from the window, expecting to see panic in his eyes, but instead found calm determination. His hands found my shoulders, anchoring me in the moment. "Whatever happens, we face it together," he said quietly. "No lies, no elaborate explanations. Just honesty." The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent in the quiet house. David's shadow filled the frosted glass panel, unmistakably his silhouette even distorted by the decorative pattern. I felt my legs go weak with terror and adrenaline. "I can't," I whispered. "I'm not ready for this conversation." "Yes, you are." Michael's conviction surprised me. "You've been ready since the moment you chose to keep seeing me. This was always going to happen eventually." Another ring, longer this time, followed by David's voice calling Michael's name. His tone was conversational, neighborly, giving no hint of suspicion. But I knew my husband well enough to recognize the controlled politeness he used when gathering information. Michael moved toward the door, and I grabbed his arm instinctively. "What are you going to say?" "The truth." He covered my hand with his. "That you're here, that we've become close, that this is complicated but real." The simplicity of it was terrifying. No elaborate deception, no careful construction of alternative narratives. Just acknowledgement of what we'd created together and faith that honesty would somehow carry us through the devastation that was sure to follow. "He'll be devastated," I said, the words barely audible. "Maybe." Or maybe he already knows something's wrong and this will be a relief. Before I could respond, Michael opened the door. David stood on the porch in his poker clothes, crisp khakis and button-down shirt, but his usual composed expression showed cracks around the edges. His eyes moved immediately from Michael to me, standing frozen in the living room like a deer caught in headlights. "Evening, David," Michael said calmly. "Is everything all right?" "I saw Sarah's car in your driveway earlier this week," David said without preamble. "And again tonight. I wanted to make sure everything was okay." The lie came so smoothly I almost believed it myself. My car hadn't been in Michael's driveway. I'd been careful about that. But David's invention of evidence told me more than his words. He'd been watching, suspicious, looking for confirmation of something he already suspected. "Everything's fine," I said, finding my voice finally. "We were just talking." David stepped into the house without invitation, his gaze taking in details with lawyer's precision: the 2 wine glasses on the coffee table, the intimate seating arrangement, the charged atmosphere that must have been obvious even to someone who hadn't been paying attention to me for years. "Talking," he repeated, the word flat with disbelief. The 3 of us stood in Michael's living room, triangle of tension that felt ready to explode. I could see David processing information, reaching conclusions, preparing arguments with the methodical approach that made him effective in courtrooms. Michael remained calm beside me, his presence both comforting and incriminating. "David," I began, but he held up a hand to stop me. 23 years, he said quietly. 23 years of marriage, and you're having an affair with our neighbor." The word affair hung in the air like an accusation and a revelation. Hearing it spoken aloud by my husband made it real in a way it hadn't been when I could rationalize it as emotional connection or temporary madness. "It's not what you think," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I knew how hollow they sounded. "Then what is it, Sarah?" David's voice remained controlled, but I could see fury building behind his careful composure. "What exactly is it when my wife spends her evenings in another man's house?" Michael stepped forward slightly, positioning himself closer to me. "David, I think Sarah and I should." "Should what?" David's attention snapped to Michael with laser focus. "Should explain how you've been pursuing my wife? Should justify breaking up a marriage for your entertainment?" "Stop." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through the masculine posturing that was threatening to derail any possibility of rational conversation. "This isn't about Michael pursuing me. This is about me making choices." David's eyes returned to me, and I saw something I hadn't expected: hurt. Real, profound hurt underneath the anger and betrayal. For all our emotional distance, for all the ways we'd grown apart, he still loved me in his way. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "What choices, Sarah? What choices have you made that I should know about?" The question demanded honesty I wasn't sure I could provide. How could I explain the slow erosion of connection in our marriage, the way I'd felt invisible for years, the reawakening I'd experienced in Michael's presence? How could I make him understand that this wasn't about rejecting him personally but about choosing a life that felt authentic? "I've chosen to remember who I am," I said finally. "I've chosen to want more than we've had." "And what have we had, exactly?" David's voice was getting louder, control beginning to slip. "A house, a life, 23 years of building something together. What wasn't enough about that?" The pain in his voice was unbearable, but the question revealed everything that was wrong between us. He saw our marriage as an achievement, a successful construction project. I saw it as a beautiful facade with nothing living underneath. "Security isn't enough," I said quietly. "Comfort isn't enough. I need." "You need what he gives you?" David's gesture toward Michael was sharp with contempt. "I need to feel alive." The words silenced all 3 of us. David stared at me as if I were a stranger, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't name. Michael remained still beside me, letting me handle this conversation that would determine all our futures. 23 years, David said again, his voice now carrying something that sounded like grief. And you don't feel alive with me. The accusation was also a question, a last attempt to understand how we'd arrived at this moment. I looked at my husband, this good man who'd given me stability and respectability and faithful companionship, and tried to find words that would honor what we'd shared while acknowledging what we'd lost. Not anymore, I whispered. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, the sound jarringly normal in the charged atmosphere. He glanced at it automatically, his face paling as he read whatever message had arrived. The poker game was cancelled, he said quietly, looking up at me with new understanding. Emergency at Jim's house. I came home early and saw lights on here. I've been sitting in my car for 20 minutes, trying to decide whether to come to the door. 20 minutes. He'd been watching, processing, preparing for this confrontation while I'd been making the choice that would change everything. David, I began, but he was already moving toward the door. Don't, he said without turning around. Don't say anything else tonight. Just don't. He paused at Michael's front door, his hand on the knob. I'll be staying at the office tonight. We'll talk tomorrow when I can think clearly. The door closed behind him with quiet finality, leaving Michael and me alone with the wreckage of my marriage scattered around us. Through the window, I watched David walk slowly to his car, his shoulders carrying defeat I'd never seen before. What have I done? I whispered, the magnitude of the destruction finally hitting me. Michael's arms wrapped around me from behind, solid and warm against the trembling that was starting to take over my body. You chose yourself, he said quietly. For the first time in years, you chose what you actually wanted. But watching David drive away, seeing the pain I'd caused written in every line of his posture, I wondered if choosing myself was worth destroying someone else. The answer to that question would determine whether I could live with what I'd just done. My phone buzzed with a text message. David's name appeared on the screen, but the message was just 4 words that made my blood freeze. I know about Chicago.